This study show high risk of bias in incomplete outcome data where they mention about the dropout of the patients during the follow-up. This is due to burdensome participation, especially patients who are doing both, which are receiving chemotherapy and rehabilitation. This is shown by the limited attendance where only 3 out of 9 patients that receive the chemotherapy complete the training. Besides, the patients that receive chemotherapy show low rate in repeated 6-minute walking distance. Next, this study show high risk of bias in selective reporting, where they fail to confirm the influence of rehabilitations on quality of life of the patients. This is because the questionnaire that are being used is not applicable to the patients that is disabled or retired and only completed by a minority of the patients. Lastly, this study has high risk of other bias, where they mention that there was an introduction of video-assisted thoracoscopic surgery to the patients. This approach caused the inclusion of the patient terminated prematurely before the planned and target number was reached, which led to the decreasing of the number of patients that involved in this study.
Now, let's have a look on a graph of risk of bias summary first. From this graph, 4 out of 7 domains included in the Cochrane Collaboration 7 evidence-based domains table were identical across the two studies, which are random sequence generation, allocation concealment, blinding of participants and personnel, and also other bias. None studies reported blinding of participants and personnel, and also both studies reported of other bias. The domain which had the greatest variations were blinding of outcome assessment, incomplete outcome data, and selective reporting. For blinding of outcome assessment, where Arbin et al. Was rated at high risk of bias, meanwhile Stick et al. At unclear risk of bias. For incomplete outcome data, Arbin et al. Was rated at low risk of bias, meanwhile Stick et al. Was rated at high risk of bias. And lastly, for selective reporting, Arbin et al. Was rated at unclear risk of bias, meanwhile Stick et al. Was rated as high risk of bias.
Based on the graph on your left screen, for this systematic review, the random sequence generation and allocation concealment, both Arbin et al. And Stick et al. Are good and green in color, which indicate low risk of bias. Next, for blinding of participants and personnel and also other bias, both studies